The spiritual teacher Ram Dass has said and written so many wise things, but there are two that are my favorite. One is, we are all just walking each other home. The other is, treat everyone you meet like God in drag. I love those on so many levels. Because of the way our training is structured, new Unitarian Universalist ministers will inevitably trot out some very predictable sermons. There will be one that's just this ponderous sermon on Unitarian history, complete with footnotes. It's really just a summary of a research paper. And then there might be a sermon on James Luther Adams' 5 Smooth Stones, or something on the history of the 7 Principles, and then there's often a very chirpy little sermon about let's not forget the Universalists, and then there should be a sermon where the newish minister will talk about their chaplaincy training, and this, you dear kind people, is my chaplaincy sermon. Let me explain. To become a credentialed Unitarian Universalist minister, a person has to receive training in chaplaincy. And this is usually done in hospitals, and it varies from like 3 months to a couple of years, depending on what that person needs for their credentials. As I was preparing to do this, you have to take classes to get ready for it, and every person who'd been through it always managed to say, don't worry, you'll get what you need to learn about in chaplaincy. Another minister told about a student who had been really uncomfortable with death and dying. It had been very traumatic, very uncomfortable. And sure enough, while he was on call, he got lots more death and dying. His patients just seemed to always die. And he had way more than any of the other students. And sure enough, by the end of the program, he was much more comfortable with death and dying. It's been observed that during chaplaincy training, people who start out as non-theists or atheists start finding themselves feeling more connected to something larger than themselves, and the people who start out as theists find themselves arguing with any God that allows so much suffering, and so it's this rearranging of the person, because whatever you need to work on, it will find you during chaplaincy training. Oh dear, what did I need to learn about? I was getting anxious because I contemplated what kind of unspoken resistance or fear, what am I denying that's going to get all up in my everything? What was it going to be all the blood? Was it going to be the trauma? Was it going to be the sick children, sick parents? What was going to so undo me that maybe I wouldn't even be able to finish? Some people drop out. I was also a little bit wary because I was going to be working in a Catholic healthcare system, and my supervisors were Baptist. How's this going to work? Jump in. Every time I would start an overnight or 24-hour weekend shift, I worried that this time I would probably be forced to confront my deepest fears. Today's the day. And yet it seemed like each time I just went about my work, the work that was asked of me, which was just, listening, crying, hugging, telling silly jokes, praying, and filling out a lot of paperwork, because hospitals have a lot of paperwork. truth be told, the work just seemed kind of simple. I mean, not easy, but simple. I mean, you just visit with people, patients, families who are otherwise really bored or lonesome, and sometimes I would be called in to help people who needed emotional or spiritual support. Not infrequently, the nurses would call for the chaplain when they were absolutely fed up with that patient. Call the chaplain. Maybe they can talk some sense into them. Here I come. It seemed kind of simple for me, but it also seemed like the other students in my group, they seemed to be having a much harder time. I mean, their shifts, they had, like massive family fights and multiple trauma victims and worse, and I just seemed to get simpler nights and simpler problems and less complicated paperwork. I remember one of my classmates was like, "Do you know how many death certificates I had to fill out?" There were seven in one night. I kept waiting for what was gonna just like undo me. Something. What was waiting for me? Among hospital workers, you're never supposed to wish one another a quiet night at the hospital. That's just going to jinx it for sure, right? So, yeah. So instead, I would wish people have a boring night. Hope you have a boring night. And then after that, because I'm there until morning, so I'd go down to the room that the chaplains were given to sleep in. And this was a room like in the sub-basement below the other three basements. It was kind of creepy. But I'd get down in that room and unbidden, I found myself just saying a small private prayer. Another UU friend of mine sends his prayers to the great to whom it may concern. But down there in the bottom of the bottom basement, I found myself lifting up prayers to a great mother, asking a great mother to just hold the entirety of the hospital, hold all of the persons in this place with compassion, support the caregivers as well as those needing the care. I'd never thought of myself as a goddess worshiping type. I mean, and I wasn't really trying to make any theological point. It just seemed like the thing to be done at that time in that place. And the great mother just seemed to be a lot closer at hand in the hospital. You see, despite all of the training, all of the preparation, all the books we had to read, once we were let loose in the hospital to do this work and just go into people's rooms, we all just kind of reverted to instinct and improvisation, because each of us found that really the only way to do this work was to just be exactly who we already were. I mean, the little thing on our badge that said chaplain, that just gave us more freedom to walk into places, but we didn't know what we were doing. So we just simply lived into what was asked of us. Late one night, my pager went off. It was a nurse asking me to come up. A patient needed surgery but was resisting, didn't want to sign the last piece of paper, and could I come? Sure. Outside of his room, the nurse pulled me aside, and the patient was a young man whose leg was badly mangled from a motorcycle wreck, and his family lived far away. They wouldn't be able to get there until the next day, and so he was all alone. He was really scared. The nurse shared her opinion with me. He just needs some mama energy. Well, as luck should have it, he was only a couple years older than my own son. Handsome, pale, and frightened. He'd never had surgery before, and he was afraid that he wouldn't wake up from the anesthesia. And so I held his hand, I smoothed his hair, I listened, and then I placed a little blessing upon him. And the tears that he'd been fighting back, they finally loosened and spilled out. He relaxed enough, and he agreed to go ahead. As they wheeled him down, I held his hand, and I promised him I'd be up to see him a little bit later. And then as they rolled him down the hall, I put a final blessing upon him, upon the surgeons and the nurses, and all the people who would be in that room with him. And then while I was at it, I just included the man who was washing the floors at 11 o'clock at night. Later on, early in the morning, I stopped up to see the patient. He was still bleary from the anesthesia, but he recognized me and he grinned. I congratulated him on surviving. And that was the great mother at work, working through me. I simply obeyed her imperative to soothe the children, no matter what their age. On another occasion, I was called to the children's hospital. The place of so many concerns. And I was called to visit with a mother who was just unraveling. It was one of those, call the chaplain. This woman was almost vibrating with worry over her toddler, her beautiful child whose head was wrapped with yards of tape to hold all of the monitoring wires in place. And so you just stick in a Thomas the Tank Engine video, sit down and to talk. The mom was exhausted, not just with the worry over her son's seizures, but with the dread of having to deal with the family members, other family members who are very reserved, emotionally reserved, and they don't display very much. And here she felt like weeping and wailing and raging and feeling judged and self-conscious on these raw emotions. And so we just talked and chatted, and I praised her beautiful child's curiosity and how well he was eating. I listened to her fears, and I recognized her bravery, and finally I offered that blessing that every parent needs to hear. I told her, "You are a wonderful mother, and you are doing a good job raising this child." She took a deep breath and nodded gratefully, and then went back to patting her son to sleep. And that was the great mother, again, working through me. I just gave voice to that deep compassion for the terrifying work of parenting. Caring for human beings, human bodies, is messy, stinky. Human bodies are very funny. These bodies are the stuff of dirt and humor. In fact, the word humor is rooted in the Latin words for bodily fluids. So often what I would bring into a patient's room was just not a readiness to witness whatever divine was apparent, but also to witness the absolute absurdity of these bodies and the silliness of our lives. And so one day I found myself offering this completely improvised prayer. Would you like a prayer? Yes. Okay, let's make one up. All the best prayers are spontaneous, jazz riffs created with whatever you have on hand. And this prayer, this woman was stuck in bed. She couldn't move her legs, unable to walk because of the pain in her hips, or as she delicately put it, her backside. This prayer included a desire to see her become unstuck and to be able to move easily into her future days. And the prayer was light and hopeful and not very serious. 2 days later, I was up on the floor and I went to see her. And where is she? She was just coming back from having made a couple laps around the nurse's station, up and walking. It was that prayer. She laughed. She said, I told my kids that you prayed for my butt. And anyone who'd do that is someone I can get along with. I demurred. I said, well, I figured that your butt is part of you and you are part of all that is holy, and so it made sense to pray for your holy butt. So we laughed about her holy butt, and healing continued. And that's the great mother at work. I mean, she is delighted by our laughter, and as it bubbles up and lifts us into our creativity, calls us forward to our creative moments. And you're still wondering, though, what was it that had to come undone? What was the dark place that I had to stop and accept? I had to accept that elegant theologies will only get you so far. After a point, it's your bodily presence, your being there that counts. And more humbling, I realized that my mother was right all along. Does that strike a chill in any of us? My mother was right. How was my mother right all along? Well, okay, and remember, my mother, she's a good lady. She's got her sensible shoes, and she brings a bean salad and an angel food cake to every church potluck. And yes, of course she drives a Prius. Years ago, when I was a young ninny, my mother tried to teach me about the goddess. But back then, I just smiled and nodded, like daughters will do. Yeah, Mom. I just dismissed the wisdom she was trying to teach me about. And well, maybe that was part of her theology, but it wasn't going to be part of mine. That's just romantic. But then I found myself in seminary reading through the 18th century German liberal theologians, reading through the lives of the great humanists, and my eyes wearied and my brain sagged. That is a very painful feeling. And I began to feel like maybe there really was no place for me in this work of ministry, if this is what ministry meant. These great men were these great thinkers with these deep, expensive words, and I was never going to be able to do that. I should probably just go back to the kitchen where I belong. Well, how was I ever going to sound like I knew what I was talking about? And as it turns out, I never will, with any certainty. And that's okay. As a chaplain, I learned that it's more important to show up than it is to be certain. The Great Mother showed this to me over and over again. Show up, even if you don't know how or why. So does this mean that I'm a full-on goddess worshiper? I don't know. But I do know that working at a Catholic hospital with Baptist supervisors did make me a much better pagan. Now, very few people actually enjoy being in the hospital, right? I'm walking in on people on one of their very worst days usually, and one man, he summed it all up. He moaned with the emotional pain more than the physical pain. He says, I hate this. I feel so bad that everyone has to work so hard to take care of me, and I don't want to be a burden to my family. They have better things to do than to care for me. Here it was. People who were ashamed of their vulnerability. People feeling guilty for needing attention. Because in this world and in this culture, we're all supposed to be upright individuals who create our own destinies as full agents. And then when we wind up in a hospital bed, all of that is just thrown upside down. We become needful, and our agency is narrowed by the margins of pain. And yes, we become dependent upon others to care for, to clean up, just to help us survive. And we must turn to one another for support in walking and guiding that spoonful of food. And often these other people are complete strangers in drab uniforms. And when I would hear that moan, I would be moved to assure the patient that this was their time to rest and receive. When it seemed appropriate, I would remind the patient that she is a child of God and that God's love was guiding all of the hands caring for her, and to just simply open herself up to receive this love. For people who chafed at the indignity of the situation, or who felt unworthy or wondered why they should even bother to survive any longer, I just suggested that truly our highest purpose is to be with one another. That just spilled out of my mouth one day. Tears were running down both of our faces, and it was completely unplanned. It just spun out of thin air from the room. The work we are here to do is just simply to be with one another. That's all. Now, some of us might also find time to love your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as you love yourself, but you might even find that you've struck upon a religion worthy of attention. But in the meantime, take this simple observation based upon my lived experience. The work we're here to do is simply to be with one another. We're given instinct and intellect, and we will make use of whatever resource we have on hand, and we'll find silliness and tears to make it all easier. But how well we do this work, how well we will be with one another, is how our lives will be measured. How do I know this? Oh, my mother told me so. The great mother told me so. Blessed be. Amen.